In the writings of Maria Valtorta, there are many different people mentioned, names mentioned, that, for example, you don't find in Scripture. When Jesus, as an adolescent, is brought to the temple and he's discussing with the doctors, which is something that we read in Scripture, we don't know who was there or what was happening. But in the writings of Maria Valtorta, she details out specifically different people. For example, Gamaliel, who is mentioned in Scripture. But Hillel, his grandfather, isn't mentioned in Scripture. Or Shammai. These are early Jewish figures that were alive at the very start of after Christ's birth and just before Christ's birth. For example, Hillel would have been an extremely important figure in the Jewish world around Christ's time, just before Christ and afterwards. And Maria Valtorta, I'd love to have been alive when she was dictating this and kind of probe her a little bit more, although her vast writings are very probable. But she makes this interesting comment in chapter 41 in volume 1 about how does she know who these people are. And she said, I have two things to tell you, and which will certainly be of interest to you. And she's saying she's probably directing this to Father Migliorini, who was her spiritual director and the priest who was typing up her handwritten notes each day, the notebooks. She would give him notebooks and he would give her back notebooks as she was getting these dictations. I've decided to write them down as soon as I came out of my supper. But as there is something more urgent, I will write them later. What I wanted to tell you at the beginning is this. Today, you were asking me how I had been able to find out the names of Hillel, Gamaliel, and of Shammai. And I was asking the same thing, when you read the writings, how does she know? It is a voice, what I called the second voice, which tells me these things. A voice even less audible than Jesus and the voices of other people who dictate. These are voices I have told you, and I repeat it, which my spiritual hearings perceives as identical to human voices. I hear them as kind or angry voices, strong or weak, joyful or sad, as if one speaks very close to me. The second voice, instead, is like a light, an intuition that speaks to my spirit, not to my spirit. It is an indication. So while I was approaching the group of disputant parties, this was when Christ is in the temple, and I did not know who was the illustrious person who was disputing so heatedly beside the old man. This interior something said to me, Gamaliel, Hillel. Yes, first Gamaliel, then Hillel. I have no doubt about it. While I was wondering who they were, an interior monitor pointed out a third unpleasant individual to me, just as Gamaliel was calling him by name. And I was thus able to learn who was the man with the Pharisaic appearance. And so, if you read chapter 41 in volume 1 of Maria Valtorta's work, The Poem of the Man God, or The Gospel as Revealed to Me, I'm going to use The Gospel as Revealed to Me because that's the current edition that has been published. And you in that chapter you see the child Jesus, the adolescent Jesus, disputing with the doctors in the temple. That famous scripture part of the Gospels, when and then they find out, oh, where's Jesus? And then they go back to Jerusalem to find Jesus. We don't know in scripture what happened, but Maria Valtorta details it out and details the people out. And further on, I think it's chapter 160. We see Christ going with his disciples from Naphtali to Jescala. And on that trip, and these are cities that you can find in Israel, on that trip, Christ again. This is many years later, 20 years later. Christ meets Gamaliel, who is going to the tomb of Hillel, his grandfather, on Meron. And I was reading all of this, and I was saying, well, Maria Valtorta has an incredible amount of detail. The tomb exists, Hillel exists, but he is more documented out in Jewish history. Is not even mentioned in biblical, in the Bible, in Scripture. And yet he did exist. He was Gamaliel's grandfather. And, I mean, when you think about all of the details, if you're going to construct a lie, for example, say Maria Valtorta was this very astute, incredible woman that invented this whole story, embellished the story, you would have to be an absolute genius to nail so many different points and to bring them into your story. You would have to understand Jewish world, Jewish history, Jewish custom, so many fine details of that era in order to weave them into your story. Who is Gamaliel? Who is Hillel? Who is Shammai? And these, Hillel and Shammai, were two very, very important people of that era, in interpreting Jewish law and etc. I mean, I'm throwing this video out there to the Catholic world really to ask people to read Maria Valtorta's work, because for some reason this detail is there to call our attention to Christ's life. That I've no doubt about it. It is to call our attention to Christ's life. Even the finest detail now in sacred scripture makes I'm more attentive to sacred scripture. I mean, there are people saying, "Oh, why are you reading Maria Valtorta? You should be spending more time reading sacred scripture. You should be reading the lives of the saints and so forth." I guarantee you, if you start reading Maria Valtorta, the first thing you're going to end up doing is reading more sacred scripture. In fact, anything that different passages in Maria Valtorta, you're automatically, they're describing a scene in sacred scripture, and you're going back to sacred scripture. Like, what did sacred scripture say? Reading all of the details, meditating on it, understanding it, remembering it, understanding the connections here, because so much is interconnected. I'm just throwing this out to the biblical experts and out there that understand so much of this. We don't know much about who interrogated or who was Christ talking to when he went to the temple at age 12, more or less. And yet Maria Valtorta is able to open a window that is so intriguing in so many layers. And Gamaliel, if you look at the Acts of the Apostles, he makes that very interesting statement, to be cautious, because if we were fighting against God, we could be fighting against God, and to let the apostles go, who were creating quite a scene in Jerusalem. And why wouldn't they after Christ's resurrection? And Gamaliel does recognize something in that scene. He says, if it's from God, it will. If it's not from God, it will die. But if it is from God, it's just interesting. These people, these personages, the different interactions. It's a window that I really do think every Catholic should open and look at. There's no doubt about it whatsoever in my mind that the great Catholic figures of the Church understood Maria Valtorta. The Pope Pius XII, the Cardinal Beas, the Blessed Gabriele Allegri or Gabriel Ruschini's, Mother Teresa's, Padre Pio's. They understood something in her writings. God's finger is there. And I suppose I'm just giving you this kind of brief chapter, this brief video, just talking about these three people that we find in the first volumes, the Gamaliels, and his grandfather, and other figures. I encourage people to read it and study this work, and I guarantee you, it's not that you'll be reading less sacred scripture. You'll be constantly going back to it, constantly reading it, constantly making connections, especially with the Old Testament, which is so quoted. I mean, the amount of the Bible that is quoted in Marie Valtorta's work is so extensive and rich. It is a very rich text to read, her work. Anyway, let me know in your comments, but I'd love to see some modern day biblical experts study Maria Valtorta's works, the people, the places, because you open some chapters and you wonder, how could she have written this? How and got it so right and so exact. Anyway, God bless you. Take care. Bye bye.